September 19, 1994, Millhaven, Ohio. The chalkboard still held yesterday's assignment in Margaret Ellis's careful cursive, read chapters 12 to 14 of To Kill a Mockingbird for tomorrow's discussion. Room 204 of Millhaven High School smelled of old wood polish and the faint traces of her lavender perfume, but the teacher's desk sat empty at 7:45 a.m. 15 minutes passed when Margaret always arrived to prepare for her first period American literature class. Principal Harold Penman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he peered through the classroom window. In his 12 years working alongside Margaret, she had never missed a day without calling. The phone in the main office hadn't rung once that morning. Something felt wrong in the pit of his stomach, a sensation he'd later remember with bitter clarity. Outside, the Ohio countryside stretched endlessly in waves of golden corn, ready for harvest. September in Millhaven carried the sweet scent of ripening apples from the orchards that bordered the school grounds. The town of 4,200 residents prided itself on being the kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and children walked to school without fear. It was 1994, before cell phones and internet changed everything, when a missing person meant driving door to door and posting handmade flyers at the post office. Margaret's blue Honda Civic sat in its usual spot in the faculty parking lot, engine cold to the touch. Deputy Tom Bradley found the keys dangling from the ignition, her brown leather purse tucked beneath the passenger seat, and a neat stack of graded essays on the dashboard. Her lesson plan book lay open to Monday's page, filled out in her precise handwriting. Discuss themes of justice and moral courage. Quiz on Friday. The students began arriving at 8 a.m., backpacks slung over flannel shirts and denim jackets. Jenny Martinez was the first to notice something amiss when she found the classroom door still locked. By 8:15, a small crowd of teenagers had gathered in the hallway, whispering among themselves. Margaret Ellis had taught half their parents and older siblings. She was woven into the fabric of Millhaven, like the red brick of the school building itself. "Maybe she's sick," offered Kevin Thompson, though his voice carried doubt. Miss Ellis had taught through a bout of flu the previous winter, refusing to leave her students with a substitute during their midterm preparations. When the bell rang for second period, and Margaret still hadn't appeared, Principal Penman made the call to the sheriff's department. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed, a detail he would analyze obsessively in the years that followed. The autumn sunlight streaming through his office window seemed too bright, too normal for what was beginning to unfold. Sheriff Dale Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, his patrol car crunching over the gravel parking lot. At 55, Morrison had seen his share of missing persons cases, though most involved teenagers sneaking off to Columbus for the weekend or elderly residents wandering away from nursing homes. A respected high school teacher disappearing without a trace was unprecedented in Millhaven's quiet history. Margaret Ellis was 43 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a white cottage on Maple Street that she'd inherited from her grandmother. She taught with passion, assigning essays that made students think beyond their small-town boundaries. Her classroom walls were covered with inspirational quotes and student artwork from decades past. She attended First Baptist Church every Sunday, sang in the choir, and volunteered at the annual Harvest Festival. The last person to see Margaret alive was Janet Murphy, who worked at Morrison's general store. Janet remembered selling her a pregnancy test on Saturday afternoon, a detail that wouldn't surface until much later, buried under the assumption that a woman of Margaret's reputation couldn't possibly have such secrets. In 1994, Millhaven unmarried pregnancy was still whispered about behind closed doors, especially for someone in Margaret's position. By noon that Monday, word had spread through town like ripples across Miller's Pond. The hardware store closed early, so Frank Miller could join the search. The diner became an impromptu command center, where coffee grew cold as residents shared theories and organized search parties. Margaret's sister Patricia drove down from Cleveland, her face pale with worry as she clutched Margaret's spare house key. The cottage on Maple Street revealed nothing unusual. Margaret's bed was neatly made, her dishes washed and put away. Her cat, Atticus, named after the protagonist from her favorite novel, meowed pitifully by his empty food bowl. Everything appeared normal, except for a small detail that investigators initially overlooked. Margaret's Sunday dress hung in the closet still damp, as if she'd washed it in a hurry and hadn't had time to let it dry properly. As darkness fell over Millhaven that first night, the cornfields rustled with an ominous whisper. Flashlight beams swept across the landscape like searching eyes, but Margaret Ellis had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. October 1994, Millhaven, Ohio. 2 weeks into the investigation, the initial urgency had settled into a grinding routine of dead ends and false hopes. Sheriff Morrison had called in the State Bureau of Investigation, transforming Millhaven High School into a hub of activity that felt both hopeful and invasive. Agents in dark suits interviewed students and faculty, their questions probing into Margaret's private life with an intensity that made the tight-knit community uncomfortable. Patricia Ellis had taken a leave of absence from her job as a bank manager in Cleveland to coordinate the search efforts. She moved temporarily into Margaret's cottage, sleeping in her sister's bed and feeding Atticus, while dozens of volunteers combed through the surrounding farmland. Patricia was 3 years younger than Margaret, but carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had made her sister so beloved. The sisters had talked every Sunday evening without fail, yet Patricia realized how little she truly knew about Margaret's inner world. She never mentioned dating anyone, Patricia told Agent Sarah Collins during one of many interviews, but Margaret was private about personal matters. She said teaching was her calling, that her students were her children. The search expanded beyond Millhaven's borders. Volunteers from neighboring counties joined the effort, organized by the volunteer fire departments and local churches. They walked through corn mazes, checked abandoned barns, and dragged Miller's Pond twice. The Ohio State Highway Patrol issued bulletins across 3 states. Margaret's photograph, her school portrait showing a kind face framed by shoulder-length brown hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, appeared on milk cartons and grocery store bulletin boards. Students struggled to focus on their studies. Margaret's replacement, a young teacher named Miss Davidson from Toledo, found herself teaching to classrooms full of distracted teenagers who kept glancing at the empty desk where their beloved teacher once sat. The senior class had planned to dedicate their yearbook to Margaret, a tradition they maintained even after her disappearance, leaving a blank page with only her name and the dates, 1951. Principal Penman aged visibly during those autumn months. His usual cheerful demeanor gave way to a haunted expression that worried his wife, Dorothy. He spent long hours at school, often found in Margaret's empty classroom staring at the chalkboard as if waiting for her to return and erase the day-old assignment. He organized faculty meetings about grief counseling and hired additional security, though no one could explain what they were trying to protect against. The investigation revealed fragments of Margaret's life that surprised even her closest friends. Bank records showed she had been making regular cash withdrawals, small amounts that wouldn't typically raise suspicion, but the pattern suggested she was planning something. Her library checkout history included books on starting over in new cities and women's legal rights. Most puzzling was a receipt found in her purse for a bus ticket to Chicago, purchased but never used. Rumors began to circulate like autumn leaves caught in the wind. Some whispered that Margaret had been having an affair with a married man and left town to avoid scandal. Others suggested she'd been struggling with depression, a theory supported by her increased isolation in the months before her disappearance. The kindest rumors claimed she'd simply decided to start fresh somewhere new, though this seemed inconsistent with Margaret's deep roots in Millhaven. The most persistent theory came from Dolores Kemp, who ran the beauty salon on Main Street and served as the town's unofficial information hub. Dolores insisted she'd seen Margaret talking intensely with someone in a dark sedan behind the post office 3 days before her disappearance. But Dolores had been known to embellish stories, and investigators couldn't corroborate her account. As 1994 turned to 1995, the search scaled back. The FBI agents returned to Columbus. The milk carton photographs were replaced by new missing persons. Patricia reluctantly returned to Cleveland, though she kept Margaret's cottage exactly as it was, visiting every few months to dust the furniture and tend to her sister's garden. Atticus went to live with the Hendersons next door, who had promised to care for him if Margaret ever returned. Principal Penman established the Margaret Ellis Memorial Scholarship, funded by donations from the community. Each year, it would go to a graduating senior who planned to pursue education, keeping her memory alive while acknowledging the growing likelihood that she would never return to claim her classroom. The scholarship fund grew slowly but steadily, fed by bake sales and silent auctions, a testament to how deeply Margaret had touched the lives around her. The case file remained open, but active investigations ceased. New crimes demanded attention. Sheriff Morrison retired in 1998, passing the unsolved case to his successor with a heavy heart. Margaret's missing person poster faded in the courthouse window, curling at the edges as years passed and hope dimmed. Yet in the quiet moments between seasons, when the wind swept across the cornfields and whistled through the empty halls of Millhaven High School, some residents claimed they could still feel her presence, a gentle reminder of the teacher who had vanished one September morning, leaving behind only questions that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. By 2000, Margaret Ellis had become more legend than memory, her story told to newcomers as a cautionary tale about the mysteries that could lurk beneath small-town tranquility. The town moved forward, but part of its heart remained frozen in September 1994, waiting for answers that seemed as distant as the horizon beyond the cornfields. March 2025, Millhaven, Ohio. The renovation of Millhaven High School's gymnasium was supposed to be a routine modernization project, funded by a state grant and community fundraising that had taken nearly 5 years to complete. The old wooden bleachers, installed in 1967, had become a safety hazard with loose bolts and splintering boards that creaked ominously during basketball games. What contractor Mike Rodriguez discovered beneath them would shatter 3 decades of silence. Rodriguez had been working in construction for 22 years, long enough to expect the usual debris hidden under old stadium seating, lost basketballs, ancient candy wrappers, maybe some forgotten homework assignments. But on that overcast Tuesday morning in March, his crowbar struck something that didn't belong in the accumulated dust and cobwebs of decades. "There's some kind of metal box down here," Rodriguez called to his partner, Danny Walsh, who was measuring the new bleacher specifications nearby. The discovery sat wedged in a narrow space between the original concrete foundation and a support beam, positioned in a way that seemed deliberately hidden rather than accidentally lost. The rectangular metal box was roughly the size of a large shoebox, painted forest green, but now mottled with rust around the edges. It had been wrapped in heavy plastic and sealed with duct tape, clear signs that someone had intended to protect its contents from moisture and time. Rodriguez's first instinct was to open it immediately, but something about the deliberate concealment made him pause. "Maybe we should call someone," Danny suggested, wiping dust from his hands on his jeans. Both men had lived in Millhaven their entire lives. They remembered the Margaret Ellis case, had seen the missing person posters that once covered every storefront window. The box's hiding place felt too intentional, too carefully planned to be coincidental. Principal Amanda Foster, Harold Penman's successor since his retirement in 2010, arrived at the gymnasium within 15 minutes of Rodriguez's call. At 48, Foster had been a sophomore during Margaret's final year of teaching, and she still remembered the dedicated teacher who had encouraged her to pursue advanced literature courses. The discovery sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the March weather. "We need to call the sheriff's department before we go any further," Foster decided, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "If this is related to Miss Ellis." Sheriff Jennifer Murphy, no relation to Janet Murphy from the general store, had heard the Margaret Ellis story many times during her 15 years in law enforcement, first as a deputy and now as the elected sheriff. Murphy was thorough and methodical, qualities that had served her well in solving several cold cases since taking office. She arrived with crime scene photographer Dale Chen and evidence technician Maria Santos, treating the discovery with the full gravity it deserved. The gymnasium fell silent except for the click of Chen's camera as he documented the box's position and condition before removal. Santos carefully extracted it from its hiding place, noting the precision with which it had been wedged into the narrow space. "Someone knew exactly where they were putting this," she observed. "This wasn't hidden in a panic. It was placed here deliberately." The box was transported to the sheriff's department, where Murphy opened it under controlled conditions with witnesses present. Inside, wrapped in additional plastic and remarkably well preserved, were items that would rewrite everything the community thought they knew about Margaret Ellis's disappearance. The contents included 37 letters, some in Margaret's handwriting, and others in an unfamiliar masculine script. Several black and white photographs showed Margaret in casual settings, at a restaurant, walking in a park, laughing in someone's kitchen, images that none of her family or friends had ever seen. Most significant was a brown leather journal, its pages filled with Margaret's distinctive handwriting, ending abruptly with an entry dated September 17, 1994, just 2 days before her disappearance. Murphy read the final entry aloud to her assembled team, her voice growing quieter with each sentence. "I can't hide this much longer. The morning sickness is getting worse, and people are starting to notice. Harold says he'll help me figure out what to do, but I can see the panic in his eyes. What would happen to both our careers if this came out? What would happen to his marriage? I never meant for things to go this far. I just felt so lonely after all these years, and he was so kind to me when Mother was sick. But a baby. How can I explain a baby in a town like this?" The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Harold Penman, the respected principal who had led the search efforts, who had established the memorial scholarship in Margaret's honor, who had been trusted with the community's children for decades, had been having an affair with the missing teacher. More shocking still was the implication that Margaret had been pregnant when she vanished. Murphy immediately ordered DNA testing on hair samples found in the journal and cross-referencing with samples from Penman's medical records. While they waited for results, she began the delicate process of re-interviewing witnesses from the original investigation, armed with this new understanding of the case's true nature. The photographs in the box showed a side of Margaret Ellis that no one in Millhaven had ever seen. Relaxed, romantic, genuinely happy in a way that suggested deep emotional connection. The letters revealed a relationship that had developed slowly over several years, beginning as professional mentorship and evolving into something far more complicated. One letter, written in Penman's careful script, was dated just 1 week before Margaret's disappearance. "My dear Margaret, I know how frightening this must be for you. Dorothy can never know. It would destroy her, and the scandal would ruin both of us. But we'll find a way through this together. You're not alone. I promise you that. Meet me at the farm tomorrow night after Dorothy goes to her sister's. We'll make a plan that protects everyone involved." As Murphy read those words, she realized that Harold Penman, now 82 years old and living in the Millhaven Assisted Living Center, held the key to a mystery that had haunted the community for over 3 decades. The box beneath the bleachers hadn't just preserved evidence, it had preserved the truth. April 2025, Millhaven, Ohio. Harold Penman's hands shook as he sat across from Sheriff Murphy in the small visiting room of Millhaven Assisted Living Center. At 82, he was still sharp mentally. Though his body had grown frail over the decades since his retirement, the man who had once commanded respect as an educator and community leader now seemed diminished, his eyes holding the weight of 31 years of buried truth. "I've been waiting for this conversation for half my life," Penman said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day since September 19th, 1994, I've wondered when someone would finally ask the right questions." Murphy had approached the interview carefully, knowing that Penman's advanced age and fragile health required a delicate balance between justice and compassion. She'd brought along victims advocate Lisa Chen to ensure proper protocols were followed. Though she sensed that Penman was ready, perhaps even relieved, to finally tell his story. The revelation unfolded not as a dramatic confession, but as a series of quiet admissions, each one adding another piece to the puzzle that had tormented Millhaven for 3 decades. Penman confirmed what the letters had suggested. He and Margaret had begun a romantic relationship in late 1992, when his wife Dorothy was battling her own health issues and spending long periods at her sister's house in Columbus. Margaret was so dedicated to her students, so passionate about teaching, Penman recalled, staring at his weathered hands. When her mother died in '92, she was devastated. I was trying to be supportive, as her supervisor and friend, but somewhere along the way, it became more than that. The relationship had been conducted in absolute secrecy, meeting at his family's abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, or taking quiet drives to neighboring counties where they wouldn't be recognized. For nearly 2 years, they managed to maintain the facade of a professional relationship while nurturing something deeper in private. When Margaret told me she was pregnant, I panicked, Penman admitted. And not because I didn't care for her. I loved her more than I should have. But the implications, my marriage, my career, her reputation in a community that would have judged her harshly. This was 1994 in rural Ohio. An unmarried pregnant teacher would have been ostracized. Murphy listened without interruption as Penman described that final meeting on September 18, 1994. Margaret had driven to his farmhouse after evening church services, arriving around 8:30 p.m. with a plan she'd been formulating for days. She wanted to leave Millhaven quietly, relocate to a larger city where she could raise the child without scandal, and never reveal the father's identity. She had it all worked out. Penman continued, his voice growing stronger as he relieved himself of the burden he'd carried for so long. "And a teaching position in Portland, Oregon, through a colleague who'd moved there years earlier. She'd already applied and been accepted. She just needed help getting her affairs in order without arousing suspicion." But the conversation that night had taken an unexpected turn. Dorothy Penman had returned from Columbus earlier than planned, suspicious about her husband's frequent absences and emotional distance. She'd followed him to the farmhouse and confronted them both in a scene that shattered any possibility of a quiet resolution. Dorothy wasn't angry about the affair, Penman revealed, surprising Murphy with this detail. She'd known about Margaret for months. What devastated her was the pregnancy. "We'd tried for children for 15 years and never succeeded." The irony was unbearable for her. The three adults had argued through the night, emotions escalating as they tried to find a solution that would protect everyone involved. Margaret had become increasingly distressed, suffering from morning sickness and exhaustion that made her fragile and emotional. At some point during the early morning hours of September 19th, she'd collapsed, striking her head on the stone hearth of the farmhouse fireplace. "She was gone instantly," Penman said, his voice breaking for the first time during the interview. "There was no time to call for help, no chance to save her. One moment she was standing there, trying to mediate between Dorothy and me, and the next." The aftermath had been a blur of panic and poor decisions compounded by fear. Rather than call the authorities immediately, the Penmans had spent precious hours trying to decide what to do. By the time they realized they needed help, too much time had passed to explain their delay without implicating themselves in Margaret's death. "We buried her in the old family cemetery on the back of the property," Penman confessed. "Dorothy knew I was too physically weak to dig alone, so she helped me. We told ourselves we were protecting her memory, keeping her reputation intact. But really, we were protecting ourselves." The property had been sold in 1998 when Penman's health began to decline, purchased by a development company that built a small subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. Margaret Ellis lay beneath the foundation of a house on Sycamore Drive, her grave unmarked and unknown to the family, who had lived above it for over 2 decades. Murphy verified Penman's confession through additional interviews with Dorothy, now residing in a memory care facility and struggling with advanced dementia. Though her recollections were fragmented, Dorothy confirmed the essential details of that September night, her memories surfacing in brief moments of clarity that painted a picture of 3 people caught in an impossible situation. The arrest of Harold Penman at age 82 sent shockwaves through Millhaven that rivaled the original disappearance. The man who had been viewed as a pillar of the community, who had led search efforts and established memorial scholarships, who had comforted grieving students and families, had spent 31 years living with the knowledge of where Margaret Ellis truly lay. At Penman's sentencing hearing, Patricia Ellis read a victim impact statement that captured the complex emotions of a family finally receiving answers after 3 decades of uncertainty. "Harold Penman stole more than my sister's life that night. He stole our ability to grieve properly, to say goodbye, to find closure. But most tragically, he stole Margaret's chance to be a mother, something she wanted more than anything else in the world." The excavation of the Meadowbrook Estates property in June 2025 required relocating the Hendersons, the family who had unknowingly lived above Margaret's grave for years. The discovery of her remains, along with evidence that confirmed Penman's confession, brought technical closure to Millhaven's longest-running mystery. But questions remained that would never be fully answered. Why had Margaret hidden the metal box beneath the gymnasium bleachers instead of taking her personal items with her to the farmhouse that night? Had she suspected the meeting might not go as planned? The timing suggested she'd hidden the box on September 17th, the day of her final journal entry, as if preserving evidence for a future she wouldn't live to see. On a warm evening in August 2025, Millhaven held a memorial service for Margaret Ellis in the same gymnasium where her secrets had been discovered 4 months earlier. The community gathered not just to remember the teacher they'd lost, but to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the man they'd trusted to lead them had been living a lie for over half their lifetimes. Patricia Ellis, now 78 and frail but determined to see her sister properly honored, spoke to the assembled crowd. Margaret always taught her students that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. She used to quote Maya Angelou, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." Tonight, Margaret's story is finally told. As the sun set over the cornfields that surrounded Millhaven, casting long shadows across the landscape that had kept Margaret's secret for so long, the community began the difficult process of healing. The teacher who had vanished on a September morning in 1994 had finally come home, bringing with her a lesson about the devastating power of secrets and the ultimate triumph of truth. Harold Penman died in prison 18 months later, at age 83, carrying with him whatever additional details might have provided complete closure. His final words to his attorney were reportedly, "Tell Patricia I'm sorry. Tell her Margaret loved teaching more than anything, and her students meant everything to her." The Margaret Ellis Memorial Scholarship continued, funded now by a community that understood more fully the complexity of the woman they were honoring. Each year, it would remind Millhaven that beneath the surface of every small town lie stories of love and loss, of choices that echo across decades, and of truths that refuse to stay buried forever.